You're listening to The Voluntary Life, where you can hear ideas for finding freedom in an unfree world. Visit thevoluntarylife.com to connect with the show and hear all past episodes. Here's your host, Jake.
Hi, it's Jake here. Welcome to The Voluntary Life. This week's episode is an interview about building a tiny house. The idea of tiny houses is really relevant for anyone interested in travel, minimalism, and frugal living. And these are all topics that we talk about a lot on The Voluntary Life, so I hope you enjoy this interview. Before we get to that, I just want to say a big thank you to BJM, who is a new Patreon supporter this week on Patreon. If you're interested in supporting The Voluntary Life, you can also become a patron on Patreon, and you'll get lots of bonuses, including bonus episodes. I'll put a link in the show notes if you're interested in finding out more, and you can also find out more on my website, thevoluntarylife.com, and directly on my Patreon page, patreon.com/thevoluntarylife. So without further delay, here is this week's episode about building a tiny house. So I'd like to welcome a special guest to this week's show. I'm interviewing Link Wilcox. Hi, Link.
Hi, Jake.
Thank you so much for agreeing to come and talk to me. We met last week when I was on the panel for an entrepreneurship competition, which you won, and I thought was very, very justly so as well. So I'm going to talk to you about your interest in the tiny house movement. But before we get into that, could you just say a little bit about your own background, where you come from, and your story?
Okay, sure. I moved to New Hampshire in September of 2016 from Indiana as part of the Free State Project. So I had heard about this movement of people who were trying to make the world better without relying on government to do it. And they're just saying, you know what, we can take this responsibility into our own hands. We can make things better. And I thought that sounded really interesting. So I just packed up and moved. I think I heard about it in probably December of 2015. June of 2016, I came out to the Porcupine Freedom Festival and met some great people who talked me into packing up and moving by September. So it's been the most incredible year.
Wow.
Yeah. So many things have changed. I mean, I started a new job working in the cryptocurrency industry, and now I'm kind of on the front end of this project to try to build my own very small house.
Right. And your job allows you to work from home or anywhere, does it?
Yeah, I work remotely. The company provides services all over the planet, so it doesn't really matter when I'm available. Most of my correspondence is by email, so...
Right, and that I think is a great background to a very interesting aspect of your move here, which is your decision when you arrived here to build a tiny house. So now, I think a lot of people who listen to my podcast will have heard of that term, but for those who haven't, what is a tiny house?
Tiny houses, there's kind of some debate, what's the top end, what's the maximum square footage before it stops being considered a tiny house. And the one I'm building is a specific subset, tiny houses on wheels, where they're built on a trailer normally within standard size of trailers that can be towed down the highway behind a motor vehicle. So normally that means they're less than 8.5 feet wide and less than 13.5 feet tall. Mine's going to be built on a trailer that's 20 feet long, but I've seen some where they go as long as 30, 35 feet. Some of them get quite large, like almost up to 400 square feet. Mine's going to be closer to 150.
And why would you want to build a house that you can tow on a trailer?
Some people build them so that they can just take them traveling.
Right.
I don't know. For whatever reason, I don't have a travel bug. I tried. I've been a handful of different places, and for whatever reason, I'm just the kind of person who likes to stay put and, invest deeply in my community and just stay where I am. So I'm building mine partially because I want to learn the skills involved in building it, and partially just because I don't take up a lot of space the way I live. When I moved to New Hampshire, everything I brought with me fit in my Prius. So there's just a lot of wastefulness, I think, for me. If I'd been looking at buying a house, and even then, 600 square feet or something's about as small as you can find in terms of regular houses, and I just don't need that much space. So I'm hoping to build mine smaller. It gives me the freedom, too, to kind of park it in different places, or if I want to pick it up and bring it with me to PorcFest one year, since PorcFest is at a campground that has RV sites, I can just hook it up and tow it there and spend the week and then take it back to wherever I end up parking it long term.
Right. I find it really interesting, this idea of tiny houses. And I hear you talking about two different aspects. Well, three aspects, actually. There's the travel aspect, which you said isn't quite so relevant for you. There's the minimalism aspect, which I think is something that sounds like you're kind of interested in too. And there's also the financial aspect. So maybe we could talk about each of those. Obviously, the travel one's not so relevant for you, but is minimalism something that you see as part of this process of moving into a tiny house?
For me, it very much has been. Ever since I was a kid, and much to the chagrin of my mom, who expresses affection by giving gifts, I don't like having things.
Right.
For a while when I was really little, I was kind of a pack rat. And then I just realized that the more things I had, the more things I had to take care of, the more things I was responsible for. And if I could just not have them, I wouldn't have to worry about them anymore. I could spend my time invested in things that are really, truly interesting to me, things that I think have the potential to change the world. Like at this point, I have 6 identical shirts. I wear them every day. That's just my shirt. They're not even different colors. They're all the same color because I thought, every time I would look at my closet, I go, oh yes, my favorite red shirt's clean. And I found out, well, what if every day I could just look, yes, my favorite red shirt's clean. It's awesome. And then I don't have to think about it, because what shirt I wear, not going to have an impact on the world.
Yeah, you've significantly reduced the amount of decision fatigue in your life just by never having to decide what kind of shirt you're wearing. That's the Steve Jobs strategy, right?
I've heard that, yeah. Him and a few other people where they just... It wasn't something that was important to me that every day I wanted to make a decision. I know for some people what they wear is a big expression of their personality. I don't begrudge them the right to do that. It's just not something I prefer to do. To me, those things feel like distractions. And there are so many other things that I would rather do with my mental energy, like learn how to do new projects or create new things, solve interesting problems. And for me, the problem of what shirt I'm going to wear or what I'm going to have for lunch, that doesn't interest me.
Right. And I guess, the tiny house, by definition, is going to prevent you from having a different approach. And it's going to reinforce minimalism because you just simply won't have much space to store anything.
Yeah, very true. And that's been something I've been kind of building toward for a while. A couple years ago, my mom came to visit me while I was living in Indiana, and she asked if there was anything she should bring with her. I said, oh, yeah, bring a fork. She said, what do you mean, bring a fork? And I said, well, so I only have one fork. And she said, why do you only have one fork? I said, well, I only have one mouth. Like, someone had given me some forks, and they were very old, and they broke. They kind of plastic handles and stuff, so I was out of forks, so I went to the secondhand store, and I gave them a dime, and they gave me a fork. I thought it was a good deal. And she insisted on leaving her second fork with me. And I said, well... I don't need 2 forks. I have a fork. I have exactly as many forks as I can use at any given time. If I have 2 forks, I have to wash them. I have to store them. And I know that's not a great burden in the scheme of things. Like of all the problems to have, worrying about where to store a second fork is fairly minimal. But if I can remove that from my life, why wouldn't I? Instead of having to think about it over and over and over. Every day looking at... I can just remove all those tiny little bits that aren't relevant.
Right. Do you know from your design how much space you've got for, for example, clothes or all your possessions? But are you working to a specific constraint? Like, okay, I know I'm going to have 2 drawers and that's it, or something.
I haven't finalized the design, but I'm packing up actually in a couple of days and moving to the makerspace where I'm going to be building the house. And aside from some furniture that I'm bringing for the purpose of living in the apartment that's at the makerspace while I'm doing construction, I'm still going to just move with what fits in my Prius. So anything that fits in a Prius shouldn't have any trouble fitting in a tiny house.
Right. The other aspect that I really want to ask you about, because I think this is particularly relevant for my listeners, is the financial aspect. So a lot of people who listen to my show are interested in achieving financial freedom, and they're interested in different ways to do that. What is the financial argument for tiny houses?
I think the argument is that you're not paying for space you don't use, and you're not paying to heat space you don't use, and you're not paying for... in a lot of cases, like property taxes and other things for space that you're not actively using. I see sometimes these houses that have, 5,000 square feet. And that was part of growing up for me is my dad worked in the flooring industry. And so it's extremely dependent on the economy. The last thing people do when the economy tanks is replace their floors. And then, in the 90s in Northern California where we lived, everybody was making improvements to their houses. So for a while we lived in an enormous house. And we weren't any happier there. It took so much time to clean it. It took so much time, and the utilities for it were just outrageous. And so I figure if I can my goal is to build the house for less than $10,000. From what I understand from studies that other people who have been interested in tiny houses for a long time have done, the average build-it-yourself cost is closer to $25,000. I don't think I need to spend that kind of money on it. Some people do take advantage of the fact that, if you only have 10 feet of counters or something, you can go ahead and get really high-end, like granite or whatever else.
Right.
Not really my taste. So I think the financial freedom element of it is that I can pay cash to build this thing, not have any debts, not owe anyone any money. And that means that I can take the money that I do earn and either save it so I get to a point where I don't have to work for money if I don't want to, or I can invest it in things like my community that's trying to build this community space, or we're doing a coat drive. We call it Shire Sharing, where we collect jackets and stuff for people who live in New Hampshire and are going to be cold once winter rolls around. And I would rather use my money for stuff like that. I don't want to spend it on things I don't need.
Right. And so that's really interesting. And just to give a bit more of a picture of that, let's take your example moving to New Hampshire. You've obviously looked at the financials of building this tiny house and presumably looked at what the alternative would be for you, either buying a house here or renting a house here. So how do those numbers compare in terms of what you're going to be spending? Obviously, you've got the cost, which you said you're going to be spending $10K, but maybe others maybe spend more like $25 on the house itself. But then there's the land and there's taxes and those kinds of things. So can you just run me through a comparison of your costs for this housing choice compared to the alternative housing choices that that were open to you here in New Hampshire?
Yeah, I was actually under contract to buy a house before I decided to embark on this project. I had it inspected and found out the foundation was rotted out, so I didn't end up purchasing it. But it was 600 square feet, 2 bedrooms, 1 bathroom. It was small as traditional houses go, but the contract was to buy it for $125,000. Knowing full well that, I would probably spend almost all my time in one of the bedrooms and on a couch in the living room and cooking and in the bathroom. And I thought, well, this is 4 times more square feet than I need.
Right.
And in New Hampshire, because we don't have a state income tax or state sales tax, the biggest source of state revenue is property taxes. So for that house, I was looking at about $2,500 a year in property taxes. And some of that, because I don't know yet where I'm going to park the trailer full time once it's constructed, so I'm not sure exactly yet what I'm going to be looking at in terms of purchase price of property. If I wanted to rent a 1-bedroom apartment, I'd be looking at the $800-900 range on the low end, and that's not including the utilities, which water and electricity are fairly straightforward, but heat can really cost you a pretty penny in January in New Hampshire. So, I think I'm going to be able to cut the cost considerably. There's some research I need to do in terms of which towns are willing to let you live in a non-permanent structure.
Right.
On your own property. Some of them do have guidelines about that.
So your plan is then to actually buy a piece of land, get the utilities to it, and then put your house there, and then just that be it. Is that right?
That's probably the short-term plan. It kind of depends on where life goes, and I'm kind of, I think, at a stage in my life where that's not terribly clear.
Right.
Within 5 years, it's completely possible that I could still be single and living by myself and thoroughly enjoying that, or I could, I have friends who've gotten married and had 3 children within the span of 5 years.
Yeah.
So it kind of depends. I'm not really in any hurry to change that aspect of my life. I know people who have a strong drive, like, I must be married, I must have children. I I don't really feel the same way, but I'm certainly open to meeting someone who changes my mind.
Sure. And the reason I ask is because I know some people who have built tiny houses have put them on the property of like their family or friends or something. And I'm not sure what the law is like here, but I think because it's not a permanent structure, in some places you can like park it in a garden essentially. And is that, what's the situation? Would you be able to do that here or?
I think so. New Hampshire is kind of live and let live in the sense that for the most part, unless somebody files a complaint for some reason, it's not like there are police officers driving around looking for houses. And a lot of people, if you own several acres and you're living back in the woods somewhere, or you have a friend who has property, like, yeah, just, come park it here. There's a chance I'll be able to get away with something like that. I'm definitely interested in trying to work that out. I don't presently have any arrangements in terms of places I'm already expecting to be able to park it, other than the place where I'm building it. They've said that between when I finish building it and when I figure out where to put it long term, I can keep it there. I would love to eventually be able to have a place where, maybe I have several RV hookups, even if they're just back on my own property as opposed to being an RV park, so that other people could build them. And I would love to see people, build their own little tiny houses and then use that to move to New Hampshire. And then when they find where they want to stay, even if they want to have a traditional house, they just park the tiny one in the backyard and rent it out on Airbnb.
Right.
Make money to support their families. I think there's a lot you can do with a tiny house.
Yeah.
Even if you don't want to live in it full time for the rest of your life.
So if you were to buy a property, do you have a budget in mind of, if you just, because obviously you're not going to be buying a house, you're just going to be buying the land. How much is that going to set you back? Do you know?
It depends on where it is and how much it is. The closer you get to the ocean, the more expensive it is. Fortunately or unfortunately, that's where my friends are. And so that's where my community is. So I don't know. I mean, I've seen properties listed in the $30,000 to $50,000 range, which still feels like a lot to me. Like I said, I moved from Indiana, where I had owned a threeplex that I bought for less than $50,000, and I lived in one of the units and rented out the other two, and essentially had a free place to live for 3 years. So I don't know, paying $50,000 for land that doesn't have anything on it still seems a little weird to me. That's part of the process that I haven't pin down the specifics for yet.
Right.
But my goal would be to be somewhere that I can pay cash for. So, when I was looking at having a down payment for a $125,000 house, that would put it in the $25,000 range. And I think by the time I finish building it, and, it doesn't cost a lot to live my life, so saving money isn't very hard.
Will you have to pay property tax on a tiny house?
I probably will on the land in whatever way it's currently assessed. So there probably will be some level of tax on it. It goes up, if you build a permanent structure on it, that increases the value of the land, and so the taxes go up.
Right.
So yeah, one of my priorities will be to try to find a place that has minimal property taxes.
But it sounds like you've got quite a few options in terms of like when you build this thing, you're going to be able to stay at the makerspace for a while. And then there's potentially maybe you park it in somebody else's property, or maybe you buy a small piece of land and so forth. Do you have a total budget for everything that you're working to? Because you've got, like as you said, you're going to $10K for the actual building. Then there's going to be some of your own time. Then you're going to have to pay for land and so forth. What's your total budget going to be? Do you know?
I don't know yet, because I'm paying some rent, to live at the makerspace, to rent the apartment that's there, and I'm paying some also, to use the makerspace itself, which includes, access to all the tools and the expertise of the person who built the makerspace. I'm expecting that to take about 6 months, just because I don't have construction experience. So he said, looking to finish by spring would probably be fairly reasonable. So that's probably another $5,000 on top of the 10. If I'm also then looking at property in the, say, $50,000 range, I mean, 60 to 70,000 start to finish. That's kind of just a ballpark number.
Right.
But then, I would probably be looking then at like $100 a month for property tax after that. because it's New Hampshire, it would be really hard to design a solar-powered system that would provide all my electric needs. So I would probably also have an electricity cost.
Utilities. Yeah, I was going to ask you, is it going to cost you, because obviously the tiny house is quite exposed, being a small structure out there. Is it going to cost you less to heat it or more to heat it? On the one hand, you don't have much space to heat, but on the other hand, you're going to be exposed to the elements.
I'm building it with a very small wood stove. It's about a foot cubed.
Oh, wow.
It's very small. And one of the reasons I picked wood stove was it's New Hampshire. I mean, there are trees everywhere. Just everywhere. New Hampshire's never going to run out of trees. The logs that it takes are about 6 inches long, so you don't have to burn much to heat 150 square feet.
Right, and that one stove is going to be for the whole thing.
Yeah, because it's such a little space. Even just the heat that one person's body puts off. I'm going to try, right now I'm planning to use spray foam insulation, so it'll be fairly well insulated. But I'm also planning to have big windows in it because I think not putting enough windows in makes tiny houses feel a bit like coffins.
Right.
So, there's only so much energy efficiency you can get with a window. So that's part of it. I'm hoping to face the largest windows south, so at least pick up some of the sunlight in the daytime. But
let me ask you about the practical side of building it, actually, because you mentioned you don't have building experience. So how does this work? You buy plans and then you sort of essentially follow the instructions? I mean, how does it work?
Some people do. I'm one of those people who just likes to learn new stuff. So I decided to make my own plans, and under the guidance of the person who actually physically built the makerspace and the apartment that's in it. So somebody who knows what he's doing, who does know structural engineering and construction and stuff, is reviewing the plans and making sure that it's not gonna fall off the trailer. He asked me what my priorities were, and I said priority 1, it doesn't fall down. Priority 2, it stays warm. And priority 3, however I'm dealing with bathroom needs, it doesn't smell terrible.
Right.
Those are my priorities. So I've been watching lots and lots and lots of tiny house videos on YouTube and reading about different people's designs, and I'm especially looking for the people who do weird creative things. The people who put maybe just they geek out about a certain part of it. I found one guy who spent 3 years trying to design his rainwater catchment system. And then he just published it on the internet for free and was like, see, look at this thing I made. I'm like, that's genius. I'm going to steal it. And it's not really stealing, because he spent all this time doing it. I'm not going to duplicate his work. Or I found another guy who essentially I'm copying his framing structure, or it's my structure can be very strongly based on his, where he did a post and beam style construction as opposed to a traditional stick frame. So the weight of his roof is carried right above his wheels on a beam that runs horizontally across the house, and then on the 2 short walls. So, in my case, the 2 8-foot walls and these beams that are right over the wheels are going to be the only weight-bearing parts, which means that my long walls aren't load-bearing. So they need enough studs to hold things together and to hold up the windows, but I can get away with spacing them out farther. Instead of 16 on center, I can do 24 inches on center.
Which means less building work and less materials, or?
Yeah, it means quite a lot less lumber, which leads to less cost and also less weight. And that's one of the big expenses. I mean, you can spend $5,000 on a trailer if you get one that's custom designed to have a tiny house built on it. I'm building mine on what used to be an RV trailer, and the reason most people don't do that is because tiny houses are normally so heavy. They're normally 5 to 6 tons. 10 to 12,000 pounds, which normally then requires a special vehicle to tow it, either 1/2 ton, 3/4 ton, full ton. I mean, just huge trucks. And nobody seems to factor that into their building cost either. So not only are they spending $25,000 to build the house, they're spending another 10 grand, on a special vehicle just to be able to pull it around the few times that they want to move it. And for just one person, I don't want to be driving a big truck around all the time.
Yeah.
I knew somebody who did that, and it was just, for as rarely as he planned to move his house, then using this huge vehicle all the time that just, it was such a waste. So I'm trying to build mine. Most RVs are closer to 5,000 or 6,000 pounds. My trailer in particular is not designed to hold more than 3 tons. So that's kind of my absolute ceiling
limit.
Yeah, I would like to keep it under 5,000 because that can be towed by most regular SUVs, even some smaller ones like a Nissan Xterra, which is not a large vehicle, can tow 5,000 pounds. So I'm hoping that by not having to use as much lumber, I can cut down the cost quite a bit. I mean, there will be some accommodation, like I'll be running like metal strapping across diagonals and stuff, like in certain places to reinforce it, like really thin steel strapping, so that it doesn't, because if you built it out of cardboard, yeah, you could save a ton of weight and a ton of cost, but it would fall right over. And like I said, rule number 1 is I don't want it to fall down. So that's kind of how that's going to go.
And you said construction time approximately 6 months. That's for me. I'm, working full time, but I don't have a commute. So I work 40 hours a week remotely. And I'm going to be living right above where I'm going to be building. It's essentially a really big garage with an apartment on the top. And it has a door large enough that you can pull an 8.5 foot wide and 13.5 foot house in it. So yeah, I'm expecting to be able to put in probably 20 to 30 hours a week working on it. Maybe it'll go really fast. I don't know. That's because there's so many things that I don't know. I'm trying to kind of expect for it to take longer than I might want it to. Right. And it's been a really interesting project because I get to learn about electrical systems and, certain parts of the house are going to run on DC electric versus AC electric. And I just spent several hours with a friend of mine who's an electrical engineer on Friday learning how to do that. And I get to learn how all the pieces fit together. And so I kind of designed the project in stages. The first stage was sketch it out on graph paper because I know how to use a pencil and graph paper. And then now I'm trying to build it in Google SketchUp. Or I guess Google doesn't own it anymore, but it's in SketchUp. Where I'm drawing out each board and constructing the house board by board digitally. And only then, once I have it all assembled and edited and reviewed by someone who knows what they're doing, and they can look and say, yes, this isn't going to work because X, Y, and Z. And then I can edit it by clicking on it instead of having to, pull screws out and move walls. And Baxter, who's the guy who has the makerspace, told me that every hour I spend in SketchUp is 12 hours I won't spend on the build. Right. So having seen somebody that I knew build a tiny house and run into lots and lots and lots of problems, because he did just kind of take the buy plans, but then he made some edits to them and didn't have them reviewed. And so now he has a tiny house that he's probably not ever going to be able to tow. Right. So your plan is So your plan is to do a really detailed model in SketchUp. Extremely. Super interesting. So now you mentioned that you said you had some criticisms of the sort of tiny house concept or movement. I wasn't sure. So what were you alluding to there? A couple different things. Some of them have to do with the designs of the houses, but others of them are more of a philosophical nature, just because I think if people look at tiny houses as this way to simplify and downsize and reduce expenses, but then, if they want to go pay cash for one, a lot of times they're looking at, if they pay someone else to build it, $60,000 or $70,000 to buy this little house. And I don't know that that's necessarily all that useful. I mean, I suppose if you lived somewhere like California, where you're paying $500,000 for a condo, maybe it makes sense to do that. But that's still a lot of money. That's you have to have a fairly high income in the first place, I think, to be able to save that money and get it together to actually build the thing. So let me see if I understand. Your point is that people get excited about tiny houses and they end up actually paying a lot of money to get somebody else to build one for them. And then if you do that, you end up spending 60 grand or something. And then it starts to get to the point where you have to ask yourself, are you really making a saving here? Yeah. That seems to happen a lot, that people don't
I don't know, it doesn't end up being that financially prudent of a decision. Or by the time they actually finish building it, their lives have changed and they live in it for 6 months, and then they're looking at trying to sell a secondhand tiny house on a market that there's not a lot of market for used ones yet, and maybe there will be soon enough. That might actually partially fix the problem of paying $70,000 for a new one. But it seems like their lives change and their houses don't. And now they've either not thought it through enough, and so they have this house that they're kind of left staring at it going, now what am I going to do with it? I don't know. So there's that side of it. I also don't like the design of most tiny houses. Almost all of them, it seems like, are built with a lofted sleeping area. I don't like lofts. That's one of the big things for me about building this house was I did not want to have a sleeping loft, because then they either have like a ladder or a very narrow set of stairs, or, and so you go up the stairs and you like crawl across the bed and get into it. And I'm not very graceful when I wake up. So the beginning of every day for me would be waking up in this somewhat confined space, probably banging my head, then trying to crawl out of bed and try not to fall down the ladder or the stairs. And they end up feeling so cramped. Like, I know it's a tiny house. I understand that that's the idea, is that it's small, but they end up segmented off and they're just not very practical. We're looking at like, but you could sit in there, you and maybe one other person could sit in it ever.
So how are you going to get around that limitation?
I found someone online who built a tiny house with a bed it's on a motorized riser. So they're these systems that they're designed to be mounted to the ceiling in a garage, and you lower down a platform, and you can like load all the stuff that you would store in your garage onto the platform, and then you push a button and it uses a pulley system and pulls it back up to the ceiling. So this is that same kind of system. It's just hooked to the four corners of the bed, and it runs on tracks on the wall. So when you're in the bed, your weight's not being held by the pulley system. It's being held by the pegs on the tracks in the wall. So you're anchored to the studs of the wall. You're not just suspended from the ceiling, which would be an engineering challenge in the best case scenario. So yeah, that's what I'm planning to do as well. In her house, she also had it set up where underneath it was another bed, similar size, like a double or queen size bed, but she had cut it into 3 pieces and arranged the pieces to be a couch.
Right.
I thought that was pretty clever too, because my mom's big concern was, well, but if I come visit, where am I going to stay? And I said, don't worry about it. I got this. I'll put another bed in there for you. She might be the only one who ever uses it, but I would like to be able to have somebody visit occasionally.
Sure.
I don't necessarily always want to have to be in there by myself. So in that case, I could lower the top bed down halfway and kind of use it in a bunk setup.
You just have to make sure that you don't press the riser button while you're on the bed and smoosh yourself into the ceiling.
Yeah, it probably will go almost all the way up to the ceiling just to save space to be able to walk underneath it. So yeah, I'll have to make sure that maybe I'll make it so that the button is only accessible when you're standing on the ground. That's probably a good call.
So you mentioned that some people build these tiny houses and then their lives change and so forth. And you also said that you're aware that your circumstances might change. How do you think about that question of the flexibility of having a tiny house and your own future?
It's kind of hard. I mean, because it does require some degree of trying to forecast and figure out what the future will look like. But I mean, each of the 2 beds is going to be double bed size, which at least suggests you could fit a second person in it. Might be cozy, but it's a very small house. Of course it's cozy. And likewise, the beds at the bottom level, because they're in a couple different pieces, they'd be a great size for toddlers. I mean, you could easily take the couch that's in 3 pieces and have, at least 2, maybe 3 different small beds. You're still dealing with sharing 1 bathroom, but I think that's relatively common even. I mean, very rarely do you find somewhere has 1 bedroom and 2 bathrooms. So I think dealing with 1 bathroom for a growing number of people is still fairly reasonable. Plus, I mean, I think if I get to a point where I'm looking at it saying it would really make sense to go ahead and have a traditional house on a foundation, I still have the option of bringing the tiny house and parking it outside, and like I said, either renting out the space, like on Airbnb for occasional visitors.
That's a great point. That actually, then you just have an income generating house.
Yeah, and you know, I was a landlord when I lived in Indianapolis. Like I said, I had that 3-plex, and it was relatively easy to manage while I still lived there. So having somebody come and stay occasionally really doesn't seem like it would be that big of an issue.
I can see that being a winner on Airbnb because there are so many people who think tiny houses are amazingly cute and they would probably want to stay in them maybe for a couple of weeks, but they wouldn't necessarily want to build one and live in it.
Yeah. Plus, I mean, I would still have it available, you know, even if I did, say 5 years from now, I've got a husband and two children, we could still easily take it camping for a week or something. You know, we could take it on vacation and spend some time in it, even if we weren't living in it full time.
Right. So for people who are listening to this and who are interested in it, who do you think would really most benefit from thinking about a tiny house, and who do you think would least benefit?
Ooh, most benefit. I guess I would say either people who are in the same sort of transitional time of life. Like, I kind of think most of the 20s and 30s are that process of like figuring out what kind of life you want to live, what kind of person you want to be, and the less encumbered you can be in that decision-making process, the better. But then I would also say, like, on the far end of that, people who are transitioning out of, like, where their kids are grown. Like, my parents have one kid in Seattle, one kid in Tulsa, and another one in New Hampshire. So for them, if they had a small house that they could pull behind a fairly ordinary sized vehicle, like, you know, the two of them in an Xterra, and they could just go visit. And most places don't mind if you park an RV there for a few days or a couple weeks. It's just when you start talking about living in it full time that they get kind of persnickety. So, I mean, I could see that really being an advantage too. I would put those as kind of the bookends of people that I think it would benefit the most. In terms of people who would benefit the least, I mean, if you already have a big family, this is probably not the thing for you. I mean, I've seen videos where people have 3 or 4 kids and they're trying to live in a tiny house, and that might work while the kids are small, but I mean, if you have 3 teenagers,
yeah, it's not.
That's.
I think the other thing is that you have to be, in some sense, interested in living a minimalist lifestyle, because otherwise it's going to drive you bonkers.
Yeah. Well, and likewise, whoever is going to live in it with you has to be on board with the plan.
Right.
Because you do not want to put an unwilling person in that small of a space with you, because there really aren't places you can go to get away from them without going outside. So yeah, people who already have, you know, other people that this decision would affect, if you're all on the same page about it, go ahead and give it a shot. But I wouldn't recommend, you know, if you're married and have 3 children and none of them want to do this with you, it's probably not the right time. And again, you know, it might be later when you don't have the same encumbrances, but it's not a unilateral decision to make unless you have kind of a unilateral life. Like, I get to make the decisions about my life. Right. Nobody else has a reason to have that authority. So, you know, I can make that call for me. I wouldn't try to make it for a group of other people.
Okay, so for those then who are maybe single or maybe even older, people who this really appeals to and think, yeah, this fits me, if they want to start this project, well, where should they start? What should they do?
I'm tempted to say they should go to my website because I'm trying to. I'm trying to put together a resource. When I started looking at building this, I got completely overwhelmed. And I had this list of questions in my head, and I was trying to juggle all of them. And I just threw them all on a piece of paper, and I had the list of 150 questions that I didn't know the answer to, but that I wasn't going to let talk me out of it. And so I'm trying to reformat that and make it a giveaway, where if you go to thefreedom.link, because if you have a name like Link, if your name is a top-level domain, you really sort of have to make that pun every so often. Not freedom.link, thefreedom.link, because the person who had freedom.link registered wanted $30,000 for it. And that just seemed excessive, considering that's more than half the cost of buying my land and of building the house. So thefreedom.link, you can sign up for the mailing list, and I'll have this list of questions. And you might look at it and just think, oh gosh, this is just too many things. If you're not interested in learning new things and developing new skills, building your own tiny house is probably not a good project for you. But if you like to have that capacity, if you like to understand how the things around you work, if you want to know how to fix everything in your dwelling because you know exactly how it was put in, that's the list of questions that I started with. I kind of had them in different categories. It'll at least give you something to start thinking about, and terms that might come up when you need to do your research. And some of it's just going off the top of your head, like today I feel like learning about composting toilets, or whatever else you want to do, or collecting solar power, or how to heat a tiny space depending on your climate. I mean, there are all these. There's so many questions. That's why I've tried to put this together as a way that people can at least start to consider them.
Yeah, I think that's great. And in fact, this is also something that you want to develop and turn into a business, right? You're going to be making videos as you build the house.
Yeah, that was one of the projects that the person who built the makerspace is retiring from his other career and wants to kind of have this be his post-retirement work. And so he asked if, as the first person to build in this makerspace, I would help him make, all the instructional videos and do a video blog and stuff like that. And so I thought, well, yeah, this would be fantastic. If I'm making this design, like the least I can do is make it available to sell to people. And if they want all the detailed instructions to go with it and the write-up, I'm happy to provide that. And hopefully, I think I'm making a design that optimizes a lot of things that aren't typically optimized in tiny houses. So I'm hoping that appeals to a variety of people.
Great. Well, thank you so much for telling me all about your project and telling my listeners about your project. I think it's a really, really interesting and exciting thing to do, and I look forward to seeing how it progresses.
Me too. Yeah, it's, I'd be lying if I said I'm not a bit terrified. But yeah, it's an excited kind of terrified. So I'm trying to focus on the excitement side.
Now, people who want to keep up with what you're doing, is the freedom.link also the place to go?
Yeah, to go ahead and follow it there.
Brilliant. Good luck with your tiny house link.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for listening to The Voluntary Life. If you like this podcast, please show your support by becoming a patron of The Voluntary Life on Patreon. Your support will help to grow and improve the show, and you'll get access to a treasure trove of rewards, including bonus episodes. Visit thevoluntarylife.com to learn more.